On the other side of the screen is Bob Keating, who is an important person these days because he's part of the reason we have a Supreme Court ruling that allows Indigenous people living in America under certain circumstances to exercise their Indigenous and treaty rights in Canada with protection of the Constitution. Bob, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. I think you're going a little far. I don't know how much role I played in the Supreme Court case. I surely covered the story extensively over 2 decades. One of the most fascinating stories I've covered in the last 20 years.
Well, let's just say neither one of us can read the minds of Supreme Court justices, so who knows what role you played. Let me have some fun with you here, because you just retired, and I retired some time ago from the CBC. I think I was about 29 when I retired from the CBC, so I've had a long time to adjust. Let's pretend I'm still reading the national news and you are who you have been for 20 years, the reporter in Nelson, British Columbia, and I'm going to introduce you for coverage, okay?
Sure.
A recent Supreme Court ruling is going to affect how Indigenous people are able to cross the Canadian border from America and exercise their treaty and Indigenous rights in Canada with constitutional protection. Bob Keating has been covering this story for a while. He's our reporter in Nelson, British Columbia. Bob, what's the significance of this ruling?
It's huge. I mean, on the face of it, the ruling just says that the Sinixt Nation can cross to hunt, but it has far wider implications than that for the Sinixt, and I think for most cross-border First Nations in Canada and the US. This is really a precedent-setting ruling, never been done before in Canada, or the lawyer said anywhere they can see in the world where a First Nation has been given this kind of rights on 2 sides of the border. So as it stands right now, it's just the right to hunt, but the implications are huge because there are cross-border nations all across this land that had no hand in creating that border, but have to live with it.
Well, you've got the news hook exactly right. First time that it affects people, cross-border, Supreme Court ruling. Those are all great news hooks. You know, in grade school, we studied extraterritoriality, where a country like England would try to exercise its rights over Chinese people in China, and that was pretty dastardly on occasion. This is kind of a version of that. It's hard to get one's mind around. Please describe the facts of the case as if we were in the movie Paper Chase. What are the facts of this case?
So the facts are this: the Sinixt Nation was a thriving First Nation pre-contact. Smallpox almost completely wiped them out before they met David Thompson. David Thompson was the first explorer here in the 1890s. Before they met him, smallpox arrived and really decimated them. As many as 80% of Sinixt were gone before Thompson arrived. And then slowly they began to disappear for varying reasons. Some just moved on because they dwindled so much. Doukhobor settlers, Russian immigrants, came to this part of the world and pushed them out as well. Miners, loggers, you name it, all moved into the territory and pushed the Sinixt out. And the last Sinixt was a woman named Annie Joseph, who died around 1956 at a hospital in Vernon. And the federal government took the rare step of actually striking them from the Indian Act, declaring them extinct, saying they are a First Nation no more with rights in Canada. But what had happened is most had just gone down to the United States, to the Colville Confederated Tribes Reservation, which is a reservation in the US made up of 12 distinct tribes that the US created to basically herd First Nations, their American Indian tribes, all into one spot, the Sinixt being one of them.
Bob, let me clarify something right there. You know the expression, the law is an ass, and as a proud graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School, I like repeating that every now and then. And the ultimate lawmakers, the Parliament of Canada, can behave in the same way. Like, what's up with the Canadian government deciding that it has to declare a people who appear to have disappeared through death? Why did they have to declare them extinct? What business was it of the Canadian government's?
Well, there's a lot of suspicion on that front. So around that time, they started talking about damming up the Columbia River and turning it into a series of reservoirs right around, some say not coincidentally, right around 1956. actually began the process of building those dams in the early 60s. And the Sinixt people were inconvenient. If you have a First Nation there, it's more difficult to dam up their traditional territory. So there's a lot of people think that was involved. Why they did it back in 1956, I don't know, but it was precedent setting. I mean, we had other First Nations that went extinct. The Beothuk are the most known example in Canada of Newfoundland, but to actually strike them from the Indian Act, who knows why it was done. I talked to a researcher, tried to find out, and couldn't quite get to the bottom, but they did. They actually struck them from the Indian Act, meaning they were a people no more with no more rights in Canada, and therefore couldn't even come up to hunt in their traditional territory. And Canada is 80% of their traditional territory.
Now, as a toddler in 1956, if you were even born, you weren't covering this story. So let's fast forward to you spent the past 20 years in Nelson, I guess, and you got onto this story early. Tell me what interested you in it and how it unfolded.
It's just a fascinating story. Even the lawyers I've spoken with said there's a First Nation declared extinct in Canada that still has people, and not a few people. They're 3,500 strong now. What got me onto it was I went to Aboriginal Day back in 2000 in Castlegar, and I met a First Nation woman there who belonged to the Sinixt, and she told me this story. And you have to understand that here in Nelson and in the West Kootenay, there are no visible First Nations. And in Western Canada and in much of Canada, that is a really strange thing not to see First Nation faces. So I went to Aboriginal Day back in 2000, and most of the First Nations were from other places, and even they didn't know of the Sinixt. But this woman told me the history, and so I did a couple of documentaries back then in 2000 when I was a far younger man, and I stayed with it until then. And they launched this fight in 2010. They sent the hunter up Rick Day's Hotel to kill an elk, to phone the Conservation Service to say, I've done this, let's go into the courts. So between 2000 and 2010, it was a bit dormant, but I did stories here and there. And from 2010 to 2020, I did dozens of stories, including a half-hour documentary.
Well, short diversion, if you don't mind, kind of inside baseball for a broken down old journalist, and I'm referring to me.
You don't look broken down.
A lot of times the story is just happenstance. You get a brown envelope in the mail, or somebody calls you, or you read a press release, or you meet someone at an event like you did. It's not like you had to put on a trench coat and a snap brim hat and interview a couple of hundred people like in All the President's Men. So this story just fell in your lap, right?
Yes. And it fascinated me from the beginning. How could it not? It is such a fascinating deal. I know of no people who've been declared extinct, and it really, really affected them deeply on the Sinixt Nation. And when I went down to Inchelium, Washington, where the Sinixt are based now, just south of Kettle Falls, I really got the true story and a real feel for these people who, many of them, had never seen their traditional territory because they're not allowed back into Canada.
Now, more inside baseball, did the CBC pay your way into Washington State?
Yes. It was a show called The Dog Project. And when I pitched the story to them, fabulous show on CBC radio and a podcast as well. When I pitched it to them, they said, by all means, we love that story. Go on down to Washington. And I went down for the remembrance of an elder down there who was involved in what was called the blockade. So what really spurred the Sinixt here was initially they were building a road in the Slocan Valley, and they were plowing up Sinixt graves, and they were going to take these graves and just stick them in a museum in Victoria. And the Sinixt people in the state said, that is going too far. They came up here, set up a blockade, and that started all this 20 some years ago.
Well, another compliment to you for sticking with the story, and frankly, a compliment to the CBC for staffing a community of 10,000 people, Nelson, BC, and paying for your way to go cover this. I've worked for stations in larger communities where I couldn't get cab fare across town to cover city council. So, good for you and good for the CBC.
Yes, the CBC in British Columbia really takes rural journalism seriously. There's 5 bureaus here. I'm the only one-person bureau, but we have bureaus all across BC. And it's really important because rural journalism, as you know, as a former journalist or as a journalist now, a podcaster, is in decline. There's not enough stories coming from rural Canada. And this was one of the most fascinating I covered in the years here.
Agreed. Okay, so you cover this story over and over and over again. There are some precipitous moments, including the digging up of graves and the protesting of that, and they succeed. And how does it end up at the Supreme Court?
Well, they sent the hunter, Rick Desotel. They actually have a conservation service down there in Washington State, and they got together and said they chose a hunter named Rick Desotel who worked for them, said go up there and shoot an elk back in 2010. Phone the COs, tell them what you've done, and we'll start this court case. Go up and pick a fight. That's what they did. Go up and break the law on purpose. So he came up once in 2009. He phoned them, but they didn't lay charges. He went back up in 2010. He did the same thing. And finally, they came out and laid charges. And then it churned through the BC court system, starting with provincial court, BC Supreme, and the Court of Appeal. For 10 years, it churned through our courts here, and they hung with it. And they won at every level. And the decisions were unequivocal. That the Sinixt were the first people of this territory. You do have to keep in mind that other First Nations claim the territory, the Ktunaxa to the east and the Okanagan Nation Alliance to the west. They both said when the Sinixt started to fall apart, Sinixt people drifted to them. So they too are the Sinixt. But now, no, these three levels of BC court and now the Supreme Court have said unequivocally, this is Sinixt territory.
Well, two contextualizations, if I may. One is the choosing of someone to break an unjust law in order to test it and have it overturned is a great tradition in the protest movement. And Rosa Parks was chosen in part by Martin Luther King to sit at the front of the bus because she was an unimpeachable person. Not that anyone shouldn't have been able to, but they knew they were going to have a fight on their hands. And
or sit at a lunch counter, or go to an unsegregated school. Yes, this is the same kind of thing. Go up there and try to challenge this unjust law. And that was the only way they saw that they could achieve an end. And in the end, they were right.
And in terms of territorial disputes between and among First Nations, I mean, we have, by we, I mean Canadians, of which I'm a citizen, we Canadians have a territorial dispute with the Americans up in Alaska over a great big pie-shaped area covered in ice up there, which may have oil below it. We have disputes on the Georges Banks. I think we had one in the Juan de Fuca Strait, and we certainly had the Republic of Madawaska. So border disputes are nothing new, no matter which nation, which state, which nation, state, or country.
Yes, yes. And this one was challenged in a very effective way.
Okay, now do you get to go to the Supreme Court? Do they use any of your material, or how's that work?
No, not only did I not get to go to the Supreme Court, the Sinixt had to have special permission because we have a pandemic going on and the border was closed. So 3 of them got special permission to go to Ottawa, but even they couldn't poke their head inside the Supreme Court hearing because we're in the time of a pandemic. Rick Desotel, that hunter, told me, I am going to try to get them to see my face, to see, look, I am a human, I am not extinct. So no, I couldn't go because I would have gone when we were making plans for me to go. Then the pandemic hit. It was actually supposed to happen last spring, and the case was.
So what role did the hunter, Mr. Desotel, non-lawyer, get to play in a Supreme Court proceeding?
Well, his testimony was before the Supreme Court, and the justices read that testimony, but he did not testify. Well, they don't testify in front of the Supreme Court as lawyers. He was there offering support, and to hear it all, he could hear it closed circuit, but he actually couldn't appear before them, which normally he would have. He would have been in that courtroom just to say, not only him, there were other Sinixt that were going to go up. Only 3 of them could in the end, but had to be in a different room, and I couldn't go at all, which was difficult. I watched it on closed circuit, so the Supreme Court was actually quite excellent in providing the case for you to see. You just could not be there, and that's because of the times.
And that ruling was unequivocal as well, correct?
No, 7-2. So the rulings in BC were all unequivocal, but they were single judges. This was a 7-2 decision. There were 2 dissenting decisions.
Do you happen to know what the dissenters said?
No, I didn't read the dissenting decisions, but I imagine they just felt that it was too much of a precedent. This is 3,500 Americans that now have some kind of claim to an entire valley in British Columbia, and this valley generates billions of dollars in hydroelectric wealth because they did build those dams in the end.
Now that is the so-called WAC, or Wacky Bennett, as he was affectionately called, the Two Rivers policy of generating power to power the economic development of British Columbia. So yeah,
Very
there's
controversial. Yeah,
a
they
lot at
burned
stake
homes
there.
and farms here. So the Arrow Lakes Valley and right around to Canal Flats is basically a series of holding tanks, and the Americans hold great sway over when we release the water here. It's called the Columbia River Treaty, which is under negotiation right now. So this is a really, really interesting time for the Sinixt to have some kind of claim on that land.
Well, my interest, of course, is with other First Nations, including those that straddle the border, such as Ganasataki, I believe, and Ganawaki near the border or straddle the border, and the Beskotomokati, whose territory has always, pardon me?
The Blood Reserve in Alberta too.
So it seems to me the logical outcome of this that people who are living in what is now the United States, who are part of an original First Nation or their original territory was also in Canada or straddled Canada, or they migrated to and from, they simply get to come back and exercise treaty rights, which might include Canadian healthcare, education, entitlements, what have you.
I don't know about that. I've talked to the lawyers, and actually, that was one of the things Mark Underhill, the main lawyer, they chose well, the Sinixt. He works for one of the best constitutional firms in Canada, the firm of Joe Harvey. That Joe Harvey started, the best constitutional lawyer in Canada. Anyways, Underhill told me that was what he was fighting against, was this, the ramifications of the decision. So there are Sinixt graves all through these valleys. It is unequivocally their territory. It's the ramifications of that are the problem, right? Do they? Then these American First Nations get to come up and get healthcare and jobs and all that kind of stuff. That we don't know that. That's what comes now. That's what they have to figure out. What does this decision mean now for these First Nations that are American citizens?
Well, here we have a fun discussion between two non-lawyers about the law,
yes,
but
yes.
my oar in the water is that either by inference, by the Indian Act or by treaties, Indigenous people were entitled to education and the so-called medicine box or healthcare, and so the modern version of that is healthcare and education. Bob, you've just retired. You retired yesterday, didn't you?
Retiring this week, end of the week.
Well, there is life after CBC. I'll be happy to tell you about that. I don't think there's life outside of southern British Columbia. It's pretty nice there, so I hope you stay. But because of the pandemic and because I'm an old journalist, I've been watching Robert McNeil and his reminiscences about the JFK assassination, some of these old guys, Bill Moyers and what have you. But it seems to me that the story that you covered is ultimately more important. It might not be in the history books as much, because there have been 1,000 books written on the JFK assassination, for example. But the story that you covered from Nelson, BC, population 10,000, seems to me to be something that is more important a story than I was ever involved in. You must be very proud of that.
Yeah, I am. It was one of the most interesting cases I've ever covered. And when I went down to Inchelium and met the people down there and saw just how much that this affected them, it really struck home to me just how big a deal this was, this going to the Supreme Court and fighting this 10+ year fight. Yeah, it was an incredible, incredible story. One of the best of my career. It's been a long career. So it's been 20 years here, but 35 years in journalism.
Now, and I'll remember what James Thurber said, falling back on journalism is like falling back on a box of carpenter's tools. So I wouldn't bother considering returning. But you did mention a controversial word, and that is precedent. The Supreme Court set a precedent. And interestingly, and very often happily, the Supreme Court is not bound by precedent or even its own. So this doesn't necessarily mean the end of this story. There could be other cases.
Yes, and now the proof is in the details, right? What happens now? And so they're just working that out now. The first thing they're going to do is get a handle on how many Sinixt there are in Canada, because as I said, at the turn of the last century, the Sinixt started to break up and they went to other places. So there are Sinixt people in Canada. They have to get a handle on how many of them there are. They have an office in the Slocan Valley. They opened an office years ago, and from there they are going to begin nation building here. What kind of precedent this is, I don't know. Again, I'm not a lawyer.
Bob Keating, almost formerly of the CBC, thank you very much for your time and for this
You're welcome.
wonderful story. What are you going to do now?
Started a podcast business. So I actually have a podcast called Kootenai Time that I've just completed and posted. And I got a couple of contracts to work with nonprofits to do podcasting, just like you're doing. That really interests me because I think it's the future. I think podcasting to radio is what Netflix and the other services are to television. It's fascinating. I think it's where it's all going. So I'm jumping into that. I'm going to do some writing. I'm going to do some, hiking and biking and enjoying the summer. And then I'm a long way from retirement. I have a daughter who's just entering university and considering journalism. So yeah, I'm not retiring yet.
Well, it sounds like you have to keep earning money then.
I do. Turns out they're fairly expensive. Who
Yeah.
knew?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Bob. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.